Hi, so my name is Kimberly and this is my lesson 11 presentation. So I think conflict is something that every single person experiences. I don't think this is necessarily connected with your workplace. You experience this with friendships, relationships, schools, and any type of organization. I think most people automatically think conflict is negative, and that conflict is itself is not always the problem. So the real issue is how people handle conflict. It comes down to your communication and your problem solving skills. So for our first prompt is focus on why relationship conflicts are often the most harmful and dysfunctional type of conflict. So why is the personal conflict more dangerous than disagreements about tasks or work processes? I think one of the big ones is emotion. You're emotionally connected to something, or you're emotionally invested. So there's multiple different types of conflict. So your relationship conflict, your task conflict, and your process conflict, right? So your relationship conflict would be your conflicts based on like personality, emotions, attitudes with someone you have like a personal or any type of relationship with. Your task conflict would be disagreements on work or your goals and ideas. This, like your task one, could happen with like coworkers. Now, process conflict is conflict about how work should be completed. This can also happen over, say, managers or management, or even in the lower level between team members, like fighting over what is more efficient to get a job done. So now, why is relationship conflict more harmful? So task and process conflicts are usually more logical, and they're more, and they can also be solved logically. Now, relationship conflict often involves emotion, ego, and like feelings. Your feelings can get hurt. Once your emotions take over, people stop focusing. They stop being rational, and when that happens, they stop focusing on solving the issue and start focusing more on, depending on how big the conflict was defending themselves and attacking the other person or the other people involved. So relationship conflict typically comes down to communication, and that also has to do with all the other type of conflicts. So in a workplace setting, relationship conflict leads to employees no longer trusting each other. They can avoid communication, gossip can become a big problem, and they can even become more passive aggressive and stop collaborating together. This is really bad because once your team members don't stop collaborating together, the process and efficiency of your team can lower. So another reason why this is such a big deal is because personal attacks start replacing productive discussions. You're no longer talking with your team about the issue. People just start thinking, oh, well, it's only an issue because you're responsible, and very petty things. So instead of it being like, oh, I disagree with your idea, it's like, you never know what you're doing. Obviously, it's your fault. Like I mentioned, relationship conflict can lead to lower team performance. It also increases stress and anxiety, and it'll lower your morale of your team. Because if two people are fighting on a team, then nobody else feels comfortable either. So, relationship conflict is unlike task conflict or process conflict, because relationship conflict usually deals with damage to the trust instead of in emotion, instead of it just being something for work. Now, prompt 2. Once the conflict begins, the way people choose to handle it often depends heavily on power dynamics and the relationship between the parties. So how do people handle conflict? This definitely depending on who has more power, and why do unequal relationships create different conflict behavior. So the 5 conflict management strategies would be avoiding, accommodating, competing, compromising, and collaborating. So collaborating is usually considered the healthiest strategy, but it also takes the most time and the most effort. And depending on who's fighting and what it was about, sometimes people just don't care about doing it the healthiest way. They want to go at it. So, like, say conflict between unequal parties. This would be a manager and an employee, like a larger company and like a supplier, or even a board of directors and the CEO. The most likely strategies is avoiding and accommodating. So avoiding happens with like lower level individuals because they fear the consequences and repercussions. They might also be avoiding because they want to protect their job and their reputation. An example would be like an employee disagreeing with a manager and just staying quiet because they don't want to cause any friction and they don't want anything to be affecting them long term. An example of this is like me and my job is like if our manager is going at it, and if you don't remember, he's also the owner, so we can't defend ourselves. Even if we do defend ourselves, he kind of just goes off the rails and just, it's a whole thing. So it's kind of better just to avoid it all and keep the peace for the sake of our jobs and for the sake of the environment we're working in. Now, accommodating happens because a lower individual may want to maintain that relationship and, like I said, avoid the tension. This can happen if an employee no longer feels like they have a real choice other than to agree with their leaders, kind of like my example. Competing also may occur during like high power parties, like say your manager or large organizations using authority. An example of this would be like a large corporation forcing smaller suppliers to agree to terms. And this happens because the supplier just doesn't really have an option and they feel like they need this customer. Now, conflict between equal parties would be, say, your team members or like department heads going back to back, or companies of the same size. So during that, the most likely strategies would be compromising and collaborating. Why? Because they're equal in power, so no one really is above anybody else. Each company wants the relationship to keep going, and both companies realize it's better if they work together long term. So power dynamics are a really strong influence over conflict behavior. People handle conflict differently depending on who feels more vulnerable in the situation and who feels more powerful. So unequal relationships often create avoidance due to like fear and power imbalance, while equal relationships are more likely to involve compromise or collaboration. So for our third prompt, one of the most common conflict management strategies people use, especially in uncomfortable situations, is avoidance. So why do people avoid conflict? What are they really avoiding emotionally? And when is avoidance usually useful versus harmful? So a good place for when it's useful to avoid conflict would be like a group project or a workplace disagreement. So instead of fully going into your like frustration and your anger and your emotions taking over, you keep quiet, try to like avoid the tension because you want things to improve on themselves and you want to maintain the relationship. Like personally, in a relationship I avoided, I wanted to be able to avoid awkwardness, confrontation, emotional tension, and just arguments. I wanted to avoid the argument. Now, what was actually being avoided? This would be like fear of conflict itself, fear of being hurt or hurting the other person, fear of damaging my relationships, or just fear of escalation. People often avoid conflict because the conversation just feels uncomfortable. not necessarily because the issue is not important. Avoidance doesn't necessarily, while it might be helpful in the moment, it doesn't make the situation better long term. The tension might disappear in that moment and for a while, but that tension can come back. So, unspoken frustration can grow over time, miscommunication increases. I think avoidance sometimes feels easier in the moment because it removes that immediate tension and awkwardness, but many times that anxiety usually gets worse because that problem was never solved and it's in the back of your head. An example of this would be two coworkers that stop communicating because they want to avoid the tension. So instead of solving the issue, the communicators' collaboration weakens, the misunderstandings continue to increase, tension continues to increase because it was never solved, just ignored, and then frustration also grows. The reason why avoidance isn't typically the way to go is because problems become bigger as you avoid them. Delayed communication often leads to emotional buildup. People start creating their own assumptions, and when assumptions are made, issues are not discussed. Now, I will preface by saying that avoidance isn't always bad. I want to make that very clear. Avoidance can be useful, like I said, in situations. This would be like temporary issues, minor issues that aren't. Is it something that needs to be escalated? Like, say, small little disagreements that everyone knows is going to disappear in time. Avoiding in situations of high emotion, it's important. Sometimes it's best to just step away for a second and let those emotions calm down before getting back into the conversation, because if you don't, that can lead to a worse situation, because emotions are really high and you might say something that you don't really mean. I think choosing peace and a strategic plan is the best way instead of avoidance. Avoiding people usually, strategic plans can just help when emotions are high or when the conflicts are just minimal. For our fourth prompt, beyond managing conflict itself, organizations often also use negotiation strategies to resolve disagreements and create better long-term outcomes. So, how do useful negotiations create benefit? And why are relationships important during negotiation? So, integrative bargaining is a negotiation strategy focused on creating a win-win outcome where both sides of the spectrum win or gain something. The whole goal of this strategy is to have both sides benefit and gain something without having to defeat the other one. So the 4 integrative strategies would be separating the people from the problem. So like focusing on solving the issue without attacking the other person or the other party. Focus on interests, not positions. Would be like interest why someone wants something versus positions what someone says they want. And generate a variety of possibilities. Like brainstorming multiple possible solutions before having to decide. So say encouraging creativity instead of rigid thinking. And then insist on some fair standard. So like using some type of criteria to say that the goal is being met. So what strategies work best in negotiation cases? I think separating people from the problem is one of the biggest ones. So like for small negotiations, it's usually avoid personal attacks, focus on the issue itself professionally. So So I think using these kind of strategies is more sustainable overall instead of being aggressive during